The left sometimes calls themselves the party of the people, but they don't seem to have much regard for their fellow man and woman when they engage in tactics designed to impede ICE and CBP from getting criminal aliens off our streets and out of the United States. Why is the radical left so intent on protecting illegal aliens over U.S. citizens who are suffering the consequences of violent crime? To me, that is the most important question that remains unanswered.
Violence against law enforcement is never okay. And I speak for all my Democratic colleagues in the committee and the Senate for that matter in saying so. Violence against law enforcement is never okay. And I will continue to emphasize that as we have in the past. We will today and in the future, if for no other reason, because many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle suggest and accuse Democrats of believing otherwise. And for that reason, I refuse to give oxygen to the fire of disinformation and propaganda that this hearing was set up to ignite. And I refuse to be part of this charade.
President Biden invited millions of unvetted illegal aliens into the United States. These included hundreds of thousands of criminal aliens, violent gang members, and even individuals on the terror watch list. And where did these aliens go? They went to neighborhoods in major cities across the United States. These criminal aliens took up residence in states, counties, and cities that call themselves sanctuary cities like Los Angeles, Portland, and Chicago. Sadly, many of these communities have suffered for decades under the weight of failed policing mandates. The influx of millions of illegal aliens exacerbated the failure of these policies, resulting in skyrocketing crime. Local residents have begged their elected leaders to reverse course and to address rising crime, but to no avail. To add insult to injury, imagine their surprise when they learned that these Biden-era illegal aliens were prioritized for all types of public services, including housing, schooling, and medical care funded by their tax dollars. In some cities, police departments were hamstrung by budget cuts in order to prioritize spending on illegal immigrants. Thankfully, President Trump has listened to these concerns and fulfilled one of his most important campaign promises: to secure the border and remove illegal aliens from the United States. Aggressive immigration enforcement is not unprecedented, nor is it a particularly partisan issue. The reality is that President Obama, who was once praised for unifying the country, deported more than 2.5 million illegal aliens, earning him the title, the deporter-in-chief, at some point. But ever since President Trump was sworn into office and began prioritizing immigration enforcement, assaults and attacks on immigration agents and officers have skyrocketed. These immigration officers are law enforcement officers that are doing what their country has asked them to do, which is to enforce our laws, just like every other law enforcement officer. They carry out their sworn duties to uphold the law and arrest those who violated our laws. And make no mistake, we're talking about the arrests of criminal aliens who have committed some of the most heinous crimes: murder, rape, sexual abuse and molestation of children, aggravated robbery and assault, kidnapping, human smuggling, theft, and even acts of terrorism. But you don't have to take my word for it. DHS has published dozens of press releases highlighting the criminal aliens whom ICE and CBP have apprehended. These criminal aliens were hiding in the United States, some for years, and were allowed to continue terrorizing American communities. DHS has reported that currently more than 415,000 illegal aliens in the United States already have criminal convictions. 415,000. Of that number, nearly 400,000 aren't even detained. They're still out there somewhere in our neighborhoods wreaking havoc. There is, unfortunately, a lot of misinformation spread about among the American public by the news media and the social media, especially regarding the current laws that authorize our immigration enforcement officers and what they are allowed to do and what they're required to do, and why they have to go into these communities to arrest illegal aliens, especially in so-called sanctuary cities. Immigration enforcement officers are well-trained, and many with years of experience. The only reason that ICE and CBP must go out in our streets and seek out and arrest criminal aliens is because sanctuary cities simply refuse to cooperate with law enforcement and allow them to be transferred directly from jail if detained. According to the Center for Immigration Studies, there are currently 12 sanctuary states and more than 200 sanctuary cities and counties across the United States. Many of them have passed laws that prevent their police department from cooperating with immigration enforcement or sharing information about detained or incarcerated aliens or honoring DHS detainers. Consequently, criminal aliens are often released back into their communities, inevitably to reoffend rather than being detained before being placed into custody. This practice is not only defies common sense, but it makes the role of immigration enforcement officers much more difficult and, in the end, more painful for these communities. We've even seen some dancing grandmas trying to stop enforcement of our immigration laws, one Jane Fonda dance move at a time.
5, 6, 7, now through the grapevine. Good job.
Well, suffice it to say, some of these activists have become so divorced from reality as to be characterized accurately as unhinged. But when you give protesters information about who is being targeted and why, suddenly they see the wisdom of this action.
Hey, y'all, be careful. They're arresting people at work here. Hard-working Americans who build, the ones who do all your landscaping, work on your cars, fix all your stuff. They're coming out here taking them all. They're coming out here just taking everybody at work. Be careful, everybody. Don't go to work today.
Where do you work, child sex crimes? So.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Never mind. Weirdo. Never mind. Beto.
Many of us look to law enforcement officers for protection in cases of robbery, burglary, or assault. Why can't we extend the same level of respect to law enforcement officers who carry out our other laws that Congress has passed, like our immigration laws? The left sometimes calls themselves the party of the people, but they don't seem to have much regard for their fellow man and woman when they engage in tactics designed to impede ICE and CBP from getting criminal aliens off our streets and out of the United States. Why is the radical left so intent on protecting illegal aliens over U.S. citizens who are suffering the consequences of violent crime? To me, that is the most important question that remains unanswered. I now recognize Senator Padilla, the ranking member.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first say that violence against law enforcement is never okay. And I speak for all my Democratic colleagues in the committee and the Senate for that matter in saying so. Violence against law enforcement is never okay. And I will continue to emphasize that as we have in the past. We will today and in the future, if for no other reason, because many of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle suggest and accuse Democrats of believing otherwise. But for today's hearing, let me begin with a very simple question. Why are we here? Are we here truly to conduct oversight and find ways to actually improve the situation and public safety in our communities? Or are we simply here to throw more fuel on the political fire? Today's hearing title tells us all we need to know. Quote, "The Radical Left's Crusade Against Immigration Enforcement." That doesn't exactly set the stage for a productive, serious conversation about how we both protect law enforcement officials and improve public safety. It's the title of the next exercise in Republican political theater. That's really what's happening here. So let me once again say that violence against law enforcement is never okay. But I refuse to sit back as this committee attempts to use or condone the use of law enforcement as a shield for abuses of power by this administration. If today's hearing was indeed a serious effort to protect our law enforcement, we would have government witnesses testifying before us today and fielding our questions as a committee. But that's not the case. If today's hearing was a serious effort, those government witnesses would be providing facts and data behind the numbers that the Department of Homeland Security so often cites to claim an increase in assaults on its officers and agents. But even after repeated requests, months and months of requests from my office and from others to the Department of Homeland Security to back up their claims of is it 500%? Is it 1,000%? Now we're even hearing claims of up to 8,000% increase in assaults or death threats. They've refused to provide them. Mr. Chairman, you're very well aware of this. You and I discussed this last week. And as far as I can tell, they've even refused your requests for data and statistics. Why am I insisting on this? Why am I making this point? Because that data is critical. Not only would it allow us to actually verify their claims, but that data would be critical to informing our policy response. So no, today's hearing is not a serious attempt to protect law enforcement. It's designed to fuel the propaganda machine and encourage even more brutal immigration enforcement operations. It's designed to cover up for the fact that after President Trump pledged to go after the worst of the worst, this we do know from DHS statistics. Over 70% of those currently detained in ICE custody have no criminal record. If they were simply focused on those truly dangerous, violent criminals, there would be no objection, there would be no debate, there would be no discussion. But the reality is far from their claims. At the same time, what we are seeing every day is new acts of brutality and misuse of force in communities across the country. But my guess is that today you won't be hearing about the Department of Homeland Security's violent takedowns of peaceful, hardworking, long-term immigrants who don't have that violent criminal record that the administration wants you to believe. And I'm not just making this up. There's case after case, including a deaf DACA recipient who had his hands cuffed and his phone taken away so he couldn't communicate as he was shoved into the back of a car. You won't hear about the journalists who are threatened and assaulted, one so severely in New York they had to be hospitalized. You won't hear about the clergy being shot in the head with a pepper ball or arrested for attempting to administer the sacrament of communion to the faithful at a detention facility. And you won't hear about the 170 American citizens, there's probably more, but that's what's been documented, caught up in these chaotic immigration raids. American citizens caught up in these raids. Even as Secretary Noem lies and claims to say, when she says that no American citizens have been detained, every week we read new reports about another American who's had their neck kneeled on, their door blown off or their windows smashed, and even a pregnant woman in Florida, a United States citizen who was thrown to the ground during an arrest and who later miscarried. This is happening every day across the country. Masked agents have become so emboldened that even a Reagan-appointed federal judge recently wrote, and I'll quote, "In all our history, we have never tolerated an armed, masked secret police carrying on in this fashion," end quote. Now, this administration ignores the fundamental rights to due process every day as it carries out this authoritarian enforcement agenda, and instead has replaced it with the idea that if you look or talk a certain way, that's enough for you to be detained or even deported before you have a day in court. That's not just morally wrong. It's an attack on our fundamental liberties and the rule of law in the United States of America. But again, Republicans don't want to discuss any of this. Why? Out of fear of crossing the president and his outrage machine? Americans have had enough. They're sick of masked agents disrespecting daycares, schools, and churches, disappearing loved ones, and intimidating our communities. Americans are demanding that we do something. So, Mr. Chairman, it's clear to me that this hearing will not be a serious or constructive conversation. And for that reason, I refuse to give oxygen to the fire of disinformation and propaganda that this hearing was set up to ignite. And I refuse to be part of this charade.
Well, Senator Padilla, I think you say we're not discussing a lot of those items, but I think you just raised a lot of interesting questions that I'd be happy to discuss and ask questions of the witnesses and get their views. This is not necessarily the only hearing we're going to be having on this topic. And I think given the fact that there is so much disinformation, it's important for us to get the facts and not just rely on misinformation, which seems to be rampant.